Welcome back to the Security Plus preparation course. Today we're going to be going over section 11, which is going to be governance and compliance. So governance is the main part of GRC. So governance, regulation, and compliance is a huge field that's starting to grow within the IT industry and the cyber realm. Now, governance itself refers to the framework and policies. We're talking about the procedures, the processes that we'll use to make sure that our cyber security strategy is effective. These are known as frameworks in most cases, and depending on what we have to deal with, if you're in the banking industry or in the medical industry, there might be compliance. Compliance, on the other hand, involves adhering to external regulations, standards, and even laws. And so these govern all our data to ensure that we have proper privacy and security practices. Now, common regulations could be like GDPR, HIPAA, PCI, ISO standards. There's so many different ones out there, and we need to make sure that we meet these to avoid any legal penalties and ensure that we maintain our customer trust. So, as we go through this lesson, remember that governance and compliance ensures that the organization not only protects its information, but also legal and regulatory frameworks to safeguard the sensitive data to make sure that we have ethical security practices. And if we don't have that and we don't have proper guidance, we start risking ourselves to data breaches, fines, or even reputational damage. This would hurt us because our customers won't want to do business with us anymore. So let's talk about governance a little bit more. Governance refers to the set of policies, procedures, and frameworks that an organization can establish to maintain its control in our cybersecurity programs. It defines all the decisions that we have to make sure that we are responsible for implementing and overseeing certain decisions within our organizations. Now, we need to align these to the overall business objectives. Just having governance doesn't mean that we're completely protected. We need to ensure that we integrate cybersecurity in everything that we do within our organization. This could be with strategic planning or even risk management. This will help us respond to threats while maintaining compliance with our standards and regulations. So what does governance entail? Well, there's a few different pieces, and the first one will be the cybersecurity policies themselves. This is where we begin. They're developed with clear, well-defined policies that outline an organization's security objectives, acceptable use of our systems, maybe even our data handling, and then how do we handle incident response. These protocols will start showing the foundation of how we're going to set up the security across the entire organization. Once we have policies, then we can have roles and responsibilities. Roles and responsibilities specify specific key personnel within our organizations. They could be the Chief Information Security Officer, the IT team, compliance officers. All of these people will be responsible for maintaining, implementing, and monitoring security initiatives. Once we have our policies and we know who's going to do what, we'll go to risk management. We've talked about risk management in the previous episode, and remember that risk management incorporates the ability to identify, assess, prioritize all of our security risks. This ensures that the organization can focus all of our resources on mitigating the most significant risks to our data, systems, and operations. Because remember, we are going to prioritize it based off of risk score. And risk score is the impact and the likelihood. So remember, if we have our risk score from our impact and our likelihood, we multiply them together, we get a value, and the higher the risk score, the more critical it is for us to look within it. Once we know the risks that are going to that we need to protect within our environment, we'll move on to security control and standards. Security controls and standards are governance frameworks. They're going to help us ensure that security protocols like encryption, access management, and network security are implemented according to the standard itself. The standard could be like ISO 27001 or NIST 800-53. These are different standards that will help us understand, hey, what are the rules and are we doing it properly? These are the controls to help protect the organization's data systems from, remember, all the cybersecurity threats that we talked about in episode 2. We'll move on to performance monitoring and reporting. So it doesn't help that we just have all these security controls and standards implemented. We need to make sure that we're monitoring the effectiveness of our security controls. Are they actually providing proper protections over the risks that we've developed in the risk register? These are going to help us provide reports to the executive leadership and allows decision makers to assess how well the cybersecurity program is performing and if adjustments are needed. Because not everything is going to be a set and forget. There's going to be a lot of things that we may have to adjust depending on business needs and objectives. Which brings us finally to our continuous improvement. As a core principle of cybersecurity, the idea of continuous improvement is built in from the very beginning. Governance structures ensures that security policies, procedures, and controls are regularly reviewed, updated for any new threats, vulnerabilities, or changes within our organization. So why is governance so important to our environment? Well, for one, we need to be able to align security with business goals. Governance ensures that the cybersecurity efforts that we do on the day-to-day efforts will help the organization meet its goals by protecting things like intellectual property, or maintaining our customer trust, or even just complying with regulatory requirements. It helps us establish accountability. By defining clear roles and responsibilities, everyone from the executives to the technical teams understand their parts in maintaining the organization's security posture. It helps us manage all of the risks that we're involved with. It allows the organization itself to identify, assess, and mitigate any security risks systematically. Because remember, we're trying to reduce the likelihood and the impact of any security incident that does occur. Governance also ensures that the organization and security policies are aligned with legal and regulatory requirements, because we don't want to see anything that come against us, such as penalties or even legal action. And then finally, we have facilitating communication. Sometimes it's hard within an organization for every department to talk to each other. Governance frameworks promote open communication. So we will be talking between the security teams, management, and other stakeholders, ensuring that critical security issues are addressed promptly and effectively. Now let's talk about the specific frameworks. The frameworks that we should actually know for the SecurityPlus will be the ISO 27001. We must know things like NIST, COBIT, and the CIS controls. These are just a few of the frameworks out there. There are so many more, but let's go through these basic ones. All right. Actually, let's go back a slide. So ISO 27001 is focusing on information security management. It provides a framework to help us establish and implement security policies and controls. It's a great framework to help you have quality within your security. So ISO 27001, you've probably heard of ISO before. Normally when it comes to other organizations, like ISO 9000, 9001, we're talking about quality within like manufacturing. 27001 is all about security focused. Now, NIST cybersecurity framework was developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That's what NIST stands for. And it provides a structured approach for identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering from security incidents. This one's quite large. If you actually read the documentation on these, it depends on which environment you're in. But a lot of times, if you're going to be doing work with um, DoD or government officials, they're going to require you to follow this framework. COBIT, otherwise known as Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, this framework offers governance for best practices with a focus on IT initiatives and business objectives. The CIS control is the Center for Internet Security, and they also provide a framework that helps us improve our security postures and defend against cyber threats. Okay. So let's talk about governance structure a little bit. So governance structure refers to the formalized framework that helps define how cybersecurity decisions are made, who is responsible for implementing them, and how security is aligned with the overall objectives. Now, we briefly talked about some of this because these are the stakeholders within an organization. One of the first ones would be like the board of directors. This is the very top of the governance structure. They're the ones who are responsible for overseeing the entire cybersecurity structure. They provide strategic direction and ensure cybersecurity is integrated in the organization and its overall risk management and business strategy is sound. Okay, board of directors at their highest level. On the board of directors, a lot of times you'll find your chief information security officer, your CISO, also on the board of directors. And the CISO is responsible for developing, implementing security policies, managing risk, and ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements. Now, they may not be doing this directly. They may have a department underneath them, but they help oversee the entire security program. Okay. The Cybersecurity Steering Committee, on the other hand, is a committee that includes representatives from various departments. Now, they can have people on there from IT, legal, compliance, risk management, basically any of the groups within the organization to help determine if the security efforts that they're doing are aligned with the overall needs. They're the ones who will advise on new cybersecurity initiatives and improve upon current projects. The IT department plays a very critical role as they implement technical aspects of what is in the governance structure. IT teams are responsible for configuring, maintaining, and monitoring the organization's networks. And what they do here is they're really like, you just heard it, they implement, maintain, and monitor. That's what they do. They're not developing new things, but they are fulfilling the need and ensuring compliance. Then we have internal audits. Internal audits provide independent review of the organization's practices. So these auditors themselves help us ensure that are our security controls effective? Are we within compliance with our policies and regulations? And are we meeting our governance framework? Now, they could be internal or external, but it's definitely an internal audit. But the people who do this could either be on the payroll or hired out as an auditor for maybe once a year. We've got our legal and regulatory compliance group. These are normally legal teams to make sure that we are meeting national and international laws. They're making sure that we are protected. Okay. They advise us on legal risks and to ensure compliance with regulations. So if we're doing something in a new country, they will know the laws and regulations that we need to meet, so that way the steering committee can come up with the new policies to be implemented by the IT department. We've got the Security Operations Centers, otherwise known as the SOC. They're responsible for monitoring the organization's network and systems in real time. Now, they're monitoring for security, okay? So they're the real-time They detect, investigate, and respond to security incidents. They are not there to make sure you have a failed hard drive. That's not their job. Their job is all about security incidents. And then if they find anomalies, they try to respond to those as well. We've got our incident response team. They're tasked with incidences. So if there is a data breach or a malware infection, or a denial of service, a DDoS, for instance, they're the ones who will coordinate the efforts to contain, mitigate, and recover from the incident itself. And then finally, we have the HR department. The HR department is definitely part of this cybersecurity framework, mainly because they're responsible for implementing like background checks and ensuring that certain policies are given to employees as they get hired, such as acceptable use, data protection, or even password policies. Okay. Now, there are a couple of different types of governance structures. We've got the centralized, decentralized, and hybrid. And then in the centralized governance structure, all decisions regarding cybersecurity is made by a single central body, typically like a CISO or an executive committee. This structure helps us ensure that that all control is within the organization itself. It's very centralized, it's very consistent, and it's standardized. Some of the advantages on a centralized would be that it's consistent. It's easier to enforce because it's all within one group within the organization. Now, some of the disadvantages of a centralized, it's a little less flexible. So individual departments can't tailor their security measures for their specific needs. It's corporate wide. A decentralized government structure normally has a department or business unit owns its own cybersecurity policies and procedures. This allows each team within the organization to customize security controls on specific risks and requirements. It allows for a lot more flexibility and quicker decision for the department, but sometimes will provide an inconsistent security policy across the organization. So what you'll find mostly in a lot of organizations now is the hybrid governance structure, which allows a little bit of both, where the overall cybersecurity strategy is managed centrally, but individual departments have some flexibility to implement either additional controls to adhere for any overarching policies. Now, it does require some very strong communication and coordination to ensure that the policies are followed consistently, but it allows the best of both worlds. Let's talk about policies. Policies are formal documents that outline the organization's rules, procedures, and guidelines for maintaining and protecting its information systems, networks, and even sensitive data. These policies themselves are going to act as the framework to ensure that all employees, contractors, or even our stakeholders understands the roles and responsibilities in safeguarding the organization's digital assets. So remember, these policies themselves have a wide range of area. They can go from acceptable use of IT resources to information incident response procedures to data integrity, all the way through, and they really form the base of our security posture. So they're going to provide us with the clear expectations and behavior that we expect from everyone within the organization. So there's a few policies that you should know for the SecurityPlus. One of them would be the acceptable use policy. This helps define how employees and other users in the organizations can use our IT resources. It doesn't matter if it's a computer, email, internet, mobile device. It just shows guidelines on appropriate use of devices. It also gives us restrictions on personal use of company resources and consequences for violating the policy. We've got our access control policy, which helps grant, manage, and revoke access to systems and network. It helps us just to ensure that only authorized individuals have access to certain requirements. This is RBAC. Maybe there's an MFA requirement, multi-factor authentication. And then, is there any procedures for revoking access? So, access control policy, a lot of times you'll see this in the hiring and firing of employees or when an employee leaves the company. How do we deactivate their accounts in the proper fashion? Our next policy is going to be our data classification and handling policy. This policy helps us organize all our data, organization's data based on sensitivity, and it gives us outline procedures on how do we handle it, how do we store it, how do we transmit it, and how do we dispose of the data. It normally has those different classification labels like we talked in the previous sections of public, internal, confidential, maybe even highly confidential, and tells us exactly the guidelines for classification and guidelines for the technical aspects such as encryption, access controls, and data transfer. And finally, it will give us the data retention and disposal policies. That brings us to the incident response policy. This incident response policy outlines the procedures that will follow in case of a breach, right? It could be a data breach, malware function, a DDoS attack, whatever it may be. This document helps us minimize the damage and helps us restore operations as quickly as possible as policy. I like that. The key elements here is just how do we identify and report procedures, who's responsible, and the steps on how to mitigate and recovering from the incidents. Now, there's a lot of communication that gets involved in this one, so this is where you'll normally also find communication protocols before and after the incident. Like what is the escalation procedure itself? Then we have the password policy. Password management policy is how we create, manage, and secure passwords within the organization. This is how we determine what's the minimum password or password exploration or the password change frequency. And you may also find the multi-factor authentication requirements in here as well. We'll have the mobile device policy. This is where the employees will use mobile devices for work. It helps us define how these devices will be used and also guidelines in their main security requirements, such as passwords or biometric locks. Sometimes it will have restrictions on what the devices can be used for and even use of encryption. A lot of times we'll also put in requirements for enabling remote wipe functionality in case the device does get lost. We have the BYOD policy, the bring your own device policy, and these are getting more popular, especially with remote work, because our remote personal devices are allowed even on-site or off-site within the organization's network. Because if they are, then they're going to give us a base software and network configuration requirements, such as maybe some security requirements like certain antivirus software encryption, and then maybe we'll just deny them completely. Maybe there's rules for separating personal and business data. We don't do BYOD, and so you're not allowed to bring your device at all. We have the vendor management policy, which is what we talked about before, about what are the vendor security requirements and how do they stay in compliance with our regulation. Are there any procedures for accessing or auditing our vendor security? And is there any guidelines for handling their incidents? That's very important here. And a lot of times you'll find some business requirements in there, like you must have an MSA or an NDA in place before any of this can happen. And then lastly, we have our disaster recovery and business continuity plan. This policy outlines procedures from recovering from significant disruptions, such as natural disasters or cybersecurity incidents. These are more focused on restoring business functions and plans for data backups and restoration. They help us relocate operations in case of physical damage to the facilities and help us find roles and responsibilities for disaster recovery efforts. Okay. Policies themselves have to have clear expectations. They set clear expectations on how employees and contractors and third parties should handle the sensitive data. How do we use our IT resources and how do we respond to security incidences? This reduces the likelihood of risky behavior or security breaches caused by human error. Risk mitigation helps us establish formal policies and procedures. Organizations can proactively reduce these cybersecurity threats. We've already talked all about qualitative and quantitative risk mitigation strategies, and how do we use those. Policies also can help us enforce things like regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance may have specific data protection and cybersecurity regulations. These well-crafted policies will help ensure that the organization complies, so we can avoid definitely those penalties and legal action. The incident response itself is in an event of an incident security response. What do? It provides a clear roadmap for detecting, reporting, and responding to the threat itself. We're trying to reduce recovery time on that one. And then we need consistency across the business. Cybersecurity policies ensures that everyone have consistent practices in reducing gaps, risks, and within our security that can be exploited. Okay. Next, we have standards. So we talked about policies, but standards themselves help us establish proper guidelines. These are the best practices designed to protect an organization for information systems, network, and data from cybersecurity threats. Now, what we do here is we try to follow standard security standardizations, right? Best practices is what we like to call these. That way we can safeguard our assets, reduce the likelihood of a security breach, and definitely make sure that we have a strong security posture. So we talked a little bit about some of these standards, but let's keep going further into it. So we've got the ISO 27001. It's a risk assessment and management process. It helps provide security controls to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and it helps us do continuous monitoring and improvement of our security practices. Then we've got NIST, which is, again, developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It is a voluntary framework for managing security risks, and it's widely used, mainly because it's got 5 core functions. It's got identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. These key elements here helps us identify our assets and potential risks, implement proper security measures, detect and respond in real time, and then recover and restore to normal operations. The PCI DSS, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, helps ensure that we have encryption on card holder data, so credit card information, secure configuration for our network components like our firewalls. It helps us ensure that we have vulnerability assessments and penetration testing built into our organization, and implementation of access control and logging mechanisms. This is anyone who has to process, store, or transmit card holder data. So if you have credit card information, that's what we have to follow. Next, we've got HIPAA, which stands for protecting the sensitive patient information in the healthcare industry. It stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And HIPAA requires healthcare organizations to implement administrative, physical, technical standard safeguards to help protect PHI data. This includes encryption of PHI data. They might be role-based access control, audit trails, and so we need to make sure that we know who's accessing this sensitive data, and incident response and breach notification processes. So if you have to think about that one, think about medical. We got the GDPR, which is General Data Protection Regulation. This is the EU Privacy Act. Okay, it emphasizes transparency, accountability, and protection of individual data, including their rights, and the right to be forgotten is the way that we like to say that one. Data minimalization and making sure that we're not using your data in a way that we weren't already telling you we're going to. It has consent management, allowing us explicit consent before the data is even processed, and then security measures such as encryption and anonymization of data. The CIS controls, the Center of Internet Security Controls, just helps us prioritize actions. It implements strong access control like MFA, maintains inventory of hardware and software assets, helps us conduct regular vulnerability and patch management, and monitor systems. We've got SOX compliance, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This was because of Enron. If you have to think about SOX, think about Enron. They're an organization that, because of separation of duties, we just didn't have it. And so there was a lot of embezzlement that was occurring. So SOX compliance are controls for protecting financial reporting systems. They help log and monitor access to financial systems and data, and helps us audit the integrity of the data, especially financial data. Okay, talk about separation of duties. We've got SOC2, the Service Organization Control 2. The SOC 2 framework helps us control and ensure confidentiality and integrity of our customer data. And this helps us have available measures to make sure that, hey, if services are operational, are they secure, and is a customer data ensured to be protected? A lot of times we use the SOC here for cloud providers and other technologies to make sure that they have certain commitments to data security and operational resilience. So SOC 2 a lot of times is cloud. Okay. Let's talk about procedures now. Procedures are step-by-step instructions that describe how to implement certain security controls, respond to incidences, and manage day-to-day operations. Okay. So procedures have a few different types, and they could be access control procedures of how we access the systems, incident response procedures of how we can recover from systems, vulnerability management of how do we identify vulnerabilities and patch them, backup and data recovery. How do we back up our data? Where do we store it? How do we recover certain data points? Are there any minimum encryption and data protection here? And how do we identify data classification? How do we train our employees with security awareness? How do we make changes within our organization and make sure they're documented? And what is our data retention or disposal policy of how do we, if we do retain it, is there certain encryption and data protection acts here? We'll refer to both documents. And then when it is time to get rid of it, how do we properly dispose of our data? Some of the best practices that we can find throughout this would be we need to align with the business itself. This ensures that our procedures align with the steps within our policies, okay, or even our governance recommendations. We need to make sure that our procedures are up to date. They need to be clear and simple language. Basically, we need to test to see if, even if I have a new employee, could they follow the procedure? Do you need to test and refine it through a test bed? How do we train employees on new policies and procedures? And then how do we monitor that people are actually doing it properly? So this can include automated tools or manual audits to make sure that the procedures are being followed correctly. Okay. Some governance considerations when you're dealing with these. We need to definitely make sure that they align. Again, we need to make sure that there's clear roles and responsibility, like who's updating these, who's actually doing the protection of certain systems. We need to think about risk management. Are these built into the security framework? Are we able to update them as properly needed? We need to think about incident response and regulatory bodies. Again, are they properly written for these two pieces of the puzzle? We need to make sure that the employees themselves have a security culture. In other words, security is the first thought in their mind, in that they can identify when there's something wrong. We need to be able to continually monitor this. We also need to think about our third-party vendors. Are they also being able to follow this? Because sometimes when we're dealing with disaster recovery, we need to make sure that if we need to recover, could we recover with the third party as well? And unfortunately, there's going to need some allocation for budgeting here, so we understand if we need to update things, do we have the money to do so? And then finally, we just need to have some reporting on all of this. Let's lastly talk about compliance. Compliance is the practice of adhering to laws, regulation, to industry standards, and internal policy designed to protect the information and ensure integrity, confidentiality, and the availability of our data. And the big key here is we've talked about compliance, right? We've talked about GDPR, we talked about HIPAA, we talked about PCI, we talked about SOX. Know that there's so many more. There's like the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. There's the FISMA, which requires federal agencies to maintain security information within government data. And there are going to be consequences. So if you fail to comply, there are going to be serious consequences for organizations. It could be legal, financial, reputational, or even operational disruptions. So what do they look like? We talk about legal penalties and fines. When dealing with reputational damage, noncompliance can definitely hurt public trust in us. It could be customer, partners, or investors. They can look at operational disruptions because they can shut us down. They can include downtime or loss of critical systems due to noncompliance. Regulatory scrutiny and increased audits. Well, once you have a bad mark on your record, you might be the one that's now having to have additional audits because of this. There could be some civil litigation. Noncompliance can lead from lawsuits from customers or other business partners or even shareholders, especially if you have are shown for negligence or failure to adhere to security standards. So this normally is legal fees, settlements, and some damages that could be awarded. You could lose contracts with either government agencies or other organizations. If you don't meet specific requirements, they might just drop you as a customer or as a vendor. Okay. And then finally, we could have like our Customer Trust and Data Privacy Act. Non-compliance with data protection like GDPR, CCPA, customer privacy rights, right? They may end up turning around and doing that civil litigation. You could have increased insurance costs. And there's even things like data breach notification penalties. If you don't tell people, you may get penalized even larger. Okay. All right. Well, that entails our governance compliance. It's a little bit drier of a subject, but definitely a very important one. Okay. Make sure that you follow your flashcards, go through all of this, understand what each of the frameworks are, and how an organization could be adversely affected if they don't follow. Okay. And so throughout the flashcards, definitely make sure that you know the terminology because the SecurityPlus will test on this. All right. The next one's going to be asset and change management. So I'll see you for the next one.